For the last video on this imaginary numbers unit, we're going to learn how to graph these imaginary numbers. So when we graph imaginary numbers, we normally have an x and y axis on a graph when we're graphing real numbers. But when we're graphing imaginary numbers, we have a real axis and an imaginary axis. So our real axis is like where the x-axis normally is, and then our imaginary axis is where the y-axis normally is. Imaginary. Okay, so what that means is that when we're graphing these things, we look for the real part and then the imaginary part. And remember, in those complex numbers, it's a plus bi. So we're looking, this is our real part. And then b is our imaginary part. And so when the real part is a number, we go that many spaces right or left on the real axis, and then whatever the b is, the imaginary part, we go up or down on the imaginary axis. So let's go through the first example. The first example just says 3i, so we're going to graph 3i. Now remember, the other way to write that, because there's no real part to that, we can write 0 plus 3i. Either way, doesn't make sense or doesn't matter. We can still graph it. So I'm going to draw our graph, and then so the real part is 0, which means we don't go left or right, but the imaginary part is a positive 3. So what I'm going to do is go positive 3 up, because what normally we think of at the y-axis is really our imaginary axis, right? So the imaginary part is a 3i, which means I'm going to put a point right there on my axis, and that's how you graph just 3i, or 0 plus 3i. Once again, we didn't go left or right on the graph because there was no real part to it. Okay, let's go through another example. And this one, we want to graph 2 plus 3i. So I'm going to draw my graph again. We know that this is our imaginary part, and then this is our real part. So we're going to start with the real portion. The real portion comes in front, that's 2. So that means I'm going to go 2 to the right. It's positive 2, so I'm going 2 to the right instead of 2 to the left. And then I'm not going to plot my point yet because there's an imaginary part as well. The imaginary part is plus 3i. So because it's a positive 3i, I'm going to go up 3 on my graph. And then, so obviously you have a full graph in front of you on these examples, and you'll have the same thing on your self-check. When you graph these, you don't just like draw the lines, obviously. You're going to just go 2 to the right and then 3 up and plot your point. So your final answer would be right there. 2 to the right for the real part and then 3 up. All right, let's look at the third example. The third example, we want to graph -3 plus I. Now -3 plus I, another way to write it would be -3 plus 1i. Remember, anything with just a variable in it, we can put a 1 in front of there. So when we graph this, we're going to start with the -3. Because the -3 is your real part, we're going to go left 3 on your real axis, because it still works the same way, where this is like your positive real, this is your negative real, this is your positive imaginary, and this is your negative imaginary. So we go 3 to the left on your real portion, and then it's plus 1i, so that means we're going to go up 1 on our imaginary axis and then plot our point, 3 to the left and 1 up. There we go, that's our answer. And then the last example is -4 minus 2i, and when we graph that, the real portion is -4, so I'm going to go left 4 on my real axis, and then because the imaginary part is -2i, I'm going to go down 2 on my imaginary axis and plot my point. There we have it. That is how we graph complex and imaginary numbers.